Hello and welcome to Console Shock, retro and modern gaming chat. As always with Big Trev, but a bit of a difference in terms of host this time. I'm still here, but Stu is actually away at the moment. It's the Easter break, well, the end of the Easter break, unfortunately, and he's gone off on some adventures. But we did want to put an episode out, and thankfully I've been able to grab someone to join us who you may be familiar with, and that is Al, one of the charter members of Console Shock. But thank you very much for joining me again, Al.
My pleasure. Just here gorging on leftover chocolate from Easter, so all good on this side of things.
Oh, good. Yeah, same here. Gonna have to go on a huge diet from literally now, really.
Yeah, I've had one of those. I've had one of those cream egg, massive chocolate Easter eggs. I wish that Cadbury's just would not be cowards and would just make the big egg an actual cream egg rather than just being hollow chocolate with a little one. Yeah, just make it a full size one. That's all I want.
Yeah, I mean, it's feasible. They can surely do it, right? Not exactly. Healthy, but feasible.
It probably cost a fortune as well.
Oh yeah. Healthy, and they're rarely like healthy options are rarely fun. Whereas a giant cream egg,
Easter's not about healthy.
Of course.
It's not about healthy eating at all. No.
It's about eating crazy amounts of chocolate and cool stuff. But yeah. Looks like it's something we've both done then over the last few days, which is always good. I hope everybody listening has done it as well, although you're probably going to be hearing this a few days after Easter. But the good thing about this time of the year, we've got another bank holiday in the UK anyway. I don't know about you in Canada. Have you got anything else? Have you got any more long weekends coming up?
No, for us, I think it was the Friday we had off, and then we've had the weekend. And I happen to have today off anyway. We're recording on a Monday, cool. For context for everybody.
Yes, we are. Bank holiday Monday to be exact in the UK. But there's another one coming up. But we're going to be back to work tomorrow, unfortunately, for many of us. But yeah, Al is joining us. And what has triggered the subject matter for what we're going to try and talk about and deep dive into? There's been some rumours, probably ones that are going to become true, maybe even by the time this goes live in a few days. But there's going to be a PS5 Pro. So we've already had experience of like a mid-gen refresh situation. We had the Xbox One X back in 2017. I think just before that in 2016, we got the PS4 Pro, both of which I actually have and had at the time. Well, I didn't get them on launch or anything. I got them, so basically I had the PS4 and the Xbox One, the normal versions. And a little bit down the line, a few months after both the sort of upgraded versions of those machines were released, I decided to grab the upgraded versions because I think there were some good deals on. And I think I got the PSVR as well around the same time, the original PSVR. So I thought that'd be a good time just to get the upgraded system. So it has happened before. What did you think of those, from a few years ago now? God, 2016 is a long time ago, which is crazy to think of. Scary. What did you think of those? Were you interested? Did you own a PS4 Pro or an Xbox One X, or was it something that you didn't think was worthwhile? What were your thoughts on them?
I didn't really think worthwhile, in all honesty. And I mean, I've still got a PlayStation 3 that I'm still trying to work through some games in my library that I've not even played yet. So I'm a little behind.
PS Triple.
Yeah, but it feels like it's not the first time we've gone through this in the industry. We've had upgrades before, but this was the first time where it felt so much like a 0.5 release.
Oh yeah.
And
yes.
And then the weird thing is that, and again, I can't really talk from experience from not owning the consoles, but from what I see as an outsider, and you may be able to provide more context for this, but as somebody who is kind of keeping an eye on, like, is this the time when I'm going to upgrade?
Yeah.
It feels like they're gaining performance, and so things like graphics are improving, but it feels like we're still on the PlayStation 4 generation to some regard.
Yeah.
The games that are out now still seem to be the same games that were released back on the PS4. It's basically just you get some extra features. It's kind of like with games like Grand Theft Auto, how you can then have a first-person view, which was never available in the original releases, because you can do a little bit more. But it's not a new Grand Theft Auto game that's coming out. I mean, we are going to get one, thankfully. That's something that I'm interested in. And who knows if that will change my opinion on getting a new console.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you feel? Like, do you feel like things have moved enough since then?
I think I could see where you're coming from, actually, because we're still in a bit of probably at the end of it, but we're in a bit of a cross-gen era still. At the moment, I mean, there's still some fairly big releases that have got both a previous gen version as well as a current gen version. I mean, it is dying off a little bit now, and there's more games that are exclusive to the new console. I mean, I'm not saying none of the games coming out have been exclusive. There have been exclusives to the PS5 and the Xbox Series. But there's still a lot of, I mean, that's nothing new being a cross-gen thing. You always have a cross-gen era, in every jump to the next generation of consoles. We can just go back, relatively recently to when the 360 and the PS Triple were moving to the, more sort of side by side the PS4 and the Xbox One. You got things like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, not Shadow of the Tomb Raider, sorry, Rise of the Tomb Raider, the second game, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Quite a big PS4/Xbox One release. Actually, it had a 360 version, which is actually quite good. You got Metal Gear Solid 5. Again, a game that you kind of think of as a PS4 game and an Xbox One game. That also came out on the Triple and the 360. So, also you still got Just Dance and, and FIFA and, they still made new versions of those, or they weren't really, maybe in the case of Just Dance, but the sports games, it would be the old engine, with just updated kits and names and things like that, as opposed to them actually porting the big, the newer consoles engine over, but that they were still getting those releases. So Shadow of Mordor and all that sort of stuff was still coming out, and it's the same now. But I think with the last gen, there was a big push for 4K TVs that happened, from about they were becoming available in a more common way when the Xbox One and the PS4 came out. They weren't cheap then. They were sort of over, a couple of grand, maybe even a lot more than that. I can't exactly remember how much they would have been then. But when you got to like 2015, 16, 17, they were coming down to like under £1,000, and the PS4 and the Xbox One couldn't really render games at all at 4K resolution. It became a lot of the time they couldn't even do 1080p that great. Yeah. So they kind of, it was probably in Sony, especially Sony, who make TVs, and it was in their interest to try and make an upgraded version of a PS4 that could like work with those TVs and look better. So, and then also, Xbox didn't want to be left behind, so they made the Xbox One X. So I think it made sense then because of that big push to 4K TVs, and you had, especially with the PS4, you had like things like checkerboard rendering became an important thing, where it would just render like half the pixels in literally like a checkerboard fashion, leaving the others empty, and then it would just have an algorithm that will like fill out the rest of the image for you, which means it could use a lot less GPU power, but you'd be able to probably get a 4K close to image, even though it's not really, well, it is 4K, but it hasn't produced every pixel straight out of the GPU.
So,
you know what I mean? It's weird.
So that sounds like a new version of interlacing, but with autofill.
Yeah. 100, basically, it was pretty cool, Yeah, I had a PS4 Pro, and the games look pretty good when they use that the way they did the checkerboard rendering to give you a 4K kind of image. But Yeah, I don't feel like this time around, really. There's not. I mean, there's 8K TVs aren't a thing at all. I mean, they exist, or I know they exist, but people aren't really good. They're not being bought in a huge degree. There's no video format that's come in to make you think, oh, I want to get Terminator 2 for the 12th time on 8K Blu-ray or something. 4K Blu-rays, although I buy them. We did a console shop recently for anybody that's interested about, how I've recently kind of got into 4K Blu-rays, even though they have been out for a while, since 2016. But they're not actually doing great. They're not selling to the level that Blu-rays did in the mid-2000s, although they didn't even sell as good as a DVD, really. So yeah, it's weird. I mean, do you feel pressure from like new TVs or new video formats that might want you to get an upgrade of a TV or anything like that to take advantage of a PS5 Pro?
I don't think so, and I think part of it is because I'm trying to think how best to put this. Well, yeah. For context, you and I grew up in the 80s and 90s with the console wars, and everything was going in, was pretty fast paced. And I think that this might actually be where I'm kind of tripping up, really.
Yeah.
Consoles started to evolve quite a lot, generation to generation. And the TVs were always the quality that they were. And those would kind of catch up. And would you say that it's fair to say that is where the shift has gone, where the TVs are suddenly the things that have increased that display quality, and now the consoles are having to play catch up to even be able to render out to those?
I think there's an element to that. I think it was probably more the case with the last PS4 Pro, the mid-gen refresh that we got last time because of those 4K TVs. I don't think it's as much at the moment, but I think it's more about because the current consoles, I mean, they can struggle to hit 4K with the level of graphics they're making is kind of forcing the resolutions of games to kind of come down a bit to maintain a good frame rate. But it's a weird little battle they have to sort of do. Although often games now, which you didn't really get, I think maybe a little bit. Well, when the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X came out, it started here. But you got like fidelity mode and performance modes in games all of a sudden in consoles, which actually did happen occasionally in the past. Like if you got an N64 expansion pack, and we're going to touch upon previous generations, the similarities that we've had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
If you put an N64 expansion pack into your N64, you'd be able to run a high resolution mode or something, and that'd be an option you could kind of flick on and off in the menu, the options menu of the game. But at the moment, I think it's more about they really want to push like the big technology at the moment, perhaps. Whereas before it was we need to try and make things look good on a 4K TV. Is ray tracing, which has been a huge thing. Has been in PC gaming for a few years now with the RTX graphics cards, and since sort of the right at the end of the 2010s when those ray tracing hardware ray tracing graphics cards came in, the new consoles, well, semi-new now, I guess, the PS5 and the Xbox Series included ray tracing. Trouble is, it's a very expensive rendering technique, and it still is. To the point where if you want a really good ray traced looking, graphic in your game or graphics in your game, you're probably going to take a hit to the resolution and the frame rate for that to work. So there have been a lot of 60 frame plus per second games with the current gen, the PS5 and Xbox Series. But the trouble is a lot of those games were cross-gen games. So there might actually have been games that were developed for the PS4, or they started being developed on the PS4 and the Xbox One. Maybe even something like Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, a big like launch game for PS5, that might have started on the PS4. So when they suddenly got a brand new console with 10 times the performance of the PS4 Pro, they're like, oh, cool, we can just we'll just chuck a bit of ray tracing in, and we can increase the frame rate because the performance budget was so low relative to the power of the PS5. They could actually just have it run really nicely and at a high frame rate because it started on a lower spec, a lower target spec
Yeah.
But now, games that are being developed for the PS5 and the Series X, they're aiming for that hardware. So they're pushing that hardware. So you're kind of already hitting a bottleneck. And they're like, well, we could have, with the level of graphics we're making for this game and the ray tracing, we could probably only do it at 30 frames a second now. And perhaps people, it'll be like, well, I want things to be 60. You know, I don't like 30 frames a second. So they're like, well, how can we jump ahead again, you know, and give a bit of extra headroom to get those frame rates up? I mean, games often, like I just said, they have like a performance mode where it just turns the ray tracing off. And then all of a sudden you can get 60 frames a second. But people want their cake and eat it, sort of have their cake and eat it. So to do that, maybe you need a PS5 Pro that could have that extra horsepower. That means you can get those really great looking 4K or near to 4K ray traced graphics, but at 60 frames a second and 120 frames a second. And you touched upon the display technology. Now you get TVs that can do 120 frames a second, and 144 frames a second. And there's other technologies that I think they want to kind of shoehorn in, like frame generation, which is really cool, where basically, you know, there's a frame generator algorithm that can look at motion vectors in the last frame, and it can basically just, in an algorithm, just make the next frame, sort of automatically generate the frame. So the GPU isn't actually making the frame, it's making some of the frames. And there's, again, like the checkerboard rendering, but for the actual each individual frame of the 60 frames a second. So you can use frame generation to make the game appear smoother and get more frames without having to, you know, hammer the GPU to do it. And the current consoles don't really have that. So the new ones, they might try and apply some of that technology. So really long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, that's my very quick thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a shift in expectations and demands, because a lot of it is, you said before, like, some people can't handle 30 frames per second. I think you and I are probably more accepting of it because we grew up with that and less. And so for me, 30 frames is okay. Obviously 60 frames, a lot nicer. But I do think that there's certainly a lot of people who just cannot game under less than 60 frames per second, especially with a lot of competitive games where that can be the difference between winning and losing.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like with esports and stuff. So I totally get the reasons. And this is not like like putting that down at all. But when we look back at older systems that we grew up with, a lot of the stuff was there are limitations, and they made the best of the limitations that they had to push forward features for gameplay and things like that. As soon as 16-bit came around, obviously we're getting better colors and bigger sprites and all sorts, but still limitations that they're working in. Now it seems that the limitations are how many frames you can get out based on the performance that you have. And so it's a very different type of limitation that they're up against, and that happens to be the limitation that is where the demand is for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so like you say, there's no brand new display technology. I mean, the 4K TVs are still not 100% ubiquitous. I don't think. I mean, I only got one recently. You know, when they're becoming fairly cheap now. But the games consoles aren't necessarily, you know, hitting that 4K resolution. A lot of games still use dynamic resolution, so they go up and down the scale from 1080p to 4K to be able to keep the frame rate high. So maybe a pro console could like just hit that 4K and literally hit it. I mean, okay, maybe it still needs to cheat a little bit, you know, using frame generation for the frame rate, and also, you know, maybe some kind of checkerboard rendering or, you know, algorithms that can generate a chunk of the image without needing the GPU to do it, to get to 4K. I mean, a lot of people might scoff at that and say, well, it's not really 4K, is it? If there's an algorithm generating part of the image. But, well, if it looks identical, I mean, you see these comparisons of like FSR and DLSS, the current technologies that NVIDIA and AMD use to generate a portion of an image or to scale it up from a smaller original image. Often a really good, you know, DLSS, generate a 4K image that's been scaled up from a a lower resolution original like full image, it can look the same as the console or the PC actually generating it at 4K fully using the GPU for everything. Yeah. So it's like it kind of makes it where it's not worth. There's no point in us if we can free up some of the GPU to do other things to make that 4K look even nicer and use an algorithm to get it up to the rest when it's going to look nearly identical like anyway, but perform worse if we got the GPU to do it all. You might as well just use the algorithms to do the rest, and get that GPU processing back to do other things. So I think it's really about those technologies, adding those to the new consoles and seeing how much better they can make them look. But I don't really think. I think the majority of gamers are basically, casual people. They're people that perhaps buy a handful of AAA games. I don't think do you think they're really going to be interested in, I hope it runs at X resolution and at X frames? I think the majority of them don't really are aware of this stuff to a huge degree. Would you say that's fair?
I think it's fair, yeah. There's definitely people I've met where it's kind of like, well, if I've got a 4K TV, everything else better be 4K. Otherwise, what have I just bought that for with the amount I've invested in it? So there's a little bit of that. There's also a friend that I have who struggles a bit with motion stutter. So if there's any kind of frame rate glitching, like if there's just drop frames, it makes them feel physically sick. It's kind of like getting seasick kind of thing.
They're very sensitive to it.
Yeah. And the stuff when they're like, can you see this happening? And I'm like, I do, kind of. Doesn't bother me, but it does bother them.
Yeah.
And so anything that can mitigate stuff like that is definitely a plus for people who do have those kind of needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Then potentially a pro console would be able to do that for them. Get very high frame rates. Especially there's performance and there's quality modes. They'll probably forego the quality mode where you're going to get a cut in the frame rate. They'll just want to go for the performance every time and try and go over 60 frames a second. But yeah, I'm not sure how interesting a proposition these new, if there is it looks like there is going to be a PS5 Pro. We don't know if there's going to be a Series X Pro. I thought you would like to think they would be, because Microsoft would want to be left behind. But I'm not sure how successful it will be, really. I don't think it'll be as successful as the PS4 Pro, which wasn't a success at all. I think, so only a very small proportion of the PS4's sales went to the PS4 Pro. Literally maybe 5% or something of PS4s were the Pro model. I have to look up exactly how many. But and I think it'll be, and that's with, it's interesting. 14.3 million units were PS4 Pros out of about 130 million total PS4s. So that's like, 10% of all PS4s were the Pro model. And that's with a point in time in technology history, where there probably was a good reason to get one because of, you've got a 4K TV and you want to make the most of it.
Yeah.
And that we don't really have that now. The marketing is to get you to buy it because the ray tracing will be a bit nicer and you'll have a bit higher frame rates. There'll be people that are up for that.
Yeah.
Like we just said, there is definitely people that would be interested in that, but to the degree that it would make it worth releasing it at all, I'm not really sure. I think a much more interesting Pro anything probably would have been a Nintendo Switch Pro. Because I would have been interested in there's some games on the Switch, where they've tried to port something from, even the PS5, but certainly there've been a few games from like the PS4, Xbox One era, and they've just looked like, and they just ran like crap, just because the Switch hasn't got the power to do it. And a Pro would have been great because it could get a huge boost in performance, and you could play those same games; they'd run a lot better. And maybe it could have some FSR or DLSS type algorithms that could scale the image up to look great on a 4K TV for when you dock it. Because obviously you're kind of limited to 1080p with the Switch, and even then it might look quite janky because it might be upscaling it to that from an even smaller resolution because it's just not a powerful system. And usually those games look okay on a screen that's 5 inches or 6 inches. but on a people with a 65-inch TV, playing a really janky version of some kind of terrible port of a PS4 game, it'll look terrible. So I can actually see the appeal there.
Yeah, I think a lot of games for that system as well were just made with those limitations in mind, and so it played to the strengths of what that console was, which was good. I think as well, going back to Grand Theft Auto as the example I was using before, because for me, if I'm going to get a console, it's always about that killer app, which is a term that doesn't get used that much these days. But Grand Theft Auto, like the next one, would be probably the one that would make me start going, okay, let's look back into consoles, because there hasn't been anything out that's really gotten my interest quite so much. And where that coming out and a PS5 coming out would kind of coincide for me is I would want lots of people to get the PS5 Pro so that the non-Pro model ends up being sold a lot cheaper secondhand, and then I'm more likely to pick one up. And so that's kind of how I look at it. It's like a PS5 Pro is a good thing, not for me to buy one, but because it would make the secondhand market a little bit cheaper for people who are upgrading and want to flog off their older PS5, which is still going to be a heck of an upgrade over my PS3. So
that's a really excellent point.
Even PS4 Pro as well. Yeah, if that's suitable enough for it, then I'd even be looking at that.
Yeah, because these days, I mean, we can look at it from that price point of view. I mean, perhaps they might drop the price of the regular PS5 when the Pro comes out to to move that, to continue to sell that, and also to make the PS5 Pro look like an upgrade, just through the price on its own. Yeah. But it doesn't happen as much these days, where consoles dramatically drop in price like they used to. Like, we talked about it on Console Shock before, I think, when you've been on as well. Like, I remember when the PS1 and the N64 and the Saturn, the PS1 was like £300 when it came out in the UK. I mean, that was cheaper than the Saturn was, but it was still expensive. But that was in 1995, sort of September 95 when it came out. But by, sort of March, April 97, kind of not even 2 years later, it was already about £120. It already dropped like less than half the price. And then when we got to 98, it was under £100. Whereas, so you would see the console drop to like, I mean, God, 300 to £99 is a third of the price within, 3 years. Yeah. If it was, it doesn't happen now.
No, the worst for that was the Jaguar. Because I remember that had been out mere months. And then I remember walking into Electronics Boutique, and which really kind of frames how long ago that was. And I think it was, I can't remember if it was down to like £100 or £50, but it was like a massive drop to the point that I looked at it and went, wow, that's a 64-bit machine. That should be impressive. But how quickly that dropped in price, it was like, okay, I'm not even interested because there's something dodgy going on if it's dropping that quickly.
Yeah. And it was other thing, just like there was the Jaguar, and there was also, you've got things like, the N64. When that came out in the UK, again, using an example from the UK, it was 249 quid. And what Sony was great at this, the day that, I think it was literally the day that the N64 came out in the UK, which is March 97. So again, you're in Canada, obviously, you might tell your Canadian friends that and they'll laugh because like that's like several months after they would have got it in 96. But yeah, it was £250 here with no game. The brand new N64. On the same day, Sony dropped the price of the PS1 from £200 to £130. So you could buy a PS1 and a bunch of games, for less than the price of the N64 with nothing. And I think within like 2 or 3 months, Nintendo had to drop the price of the N64 to about £150. And I think the same thing happened with the Xbox as well when Microsoft released the original Xbox. I think this might happen in more than one market, but certainly in the UK, again, it was about £300. And Sony did the same thing when Microsoft released the Xbox. Sony dropped the price of the PS2. I can't remember what it went down to, but it was significant. And then Microsoft had to dropped the price of the Xbox shortly after that dramatically. And I think they had to give out vouchers and all kinds of things to people that had complained, bought the console at the price it was a few months ago, and now they're seeing it for much less than that. So they have to be appeased with all kinds of freebies just to sort of stop them from saying, screw you, I'm going to get a PlayStation then. But it doesn't happen. I mean, the consoles, the current gen consoles have actually gone up in price, weirdly enough. So, and I don't think we're going to be seeing, you don't really see a console go under £200 or dollars these days. They sort of hover around that £300 to £500 or $300 to $500 mark, really. Only when they go on the second-hand market, can you really get anything cheap. So, it's going to be interesting to see how it will affect the price. But, I mean, we touched upon, older generations just then, and that does actually take us to perhaps where, like earlier examples of, a mid-gen refresh, or perhaps the equivalent of a mid-gen refresh. I mean, I can't really think of something that's quite to the level of a Pro system, where it was just a brand new unit that was essentially the same and played the same games, but it had double the horsepower or something. It's mostly been things like the CD attachments for the Mega Drive and the PC Engine. Things like the 32X for the Mega Drive, of course. We touched upon it earlier, the expansion pack. I mean, did you ever buy any of these gadgets for any systems that you owned back in the day? These kind of refresh, bolt on more power sort of gadgets.
I didn't, and I initially started a generation behind most people anyway, because we couldn't really pause so much. So I was on a Master System when everybody was on the Mega Drive, and then when they kind of upgraded, I didn't know anybody with a 32X or a Sega CD at the time they were released. Later on, I have met people who've had things like the Sega CD, and so that's been nice to actually see it in all its glory. And with you saying like the equivalent of a mid-system refresh, I've always kind of found it funny that the terminology that they were life support for these things, because that's what it felt like. That it's really just this add-on, which is just trying to extend the lifespan of these machines. But this kind of goes back to, I think, what it was like at a school, where the playground is where a lot of this conversation happened. There was, of course, the different wars as to, which was better, Sega versus Nintendo. People talk about 8 bits and 16 bits. And then the moment that Sega were like, we've got a 32-bit add-on, nobody was really excited about it. And I think that says a lot about what the state of the thing was. I mean, obviously you look back and people already knew that the Sega Saturn was coming, which was a 32-bit machine. So that's why there was a lot of confusion as to why the 32X even needed to exist. But at the same time, I think the concept of bits, and there just wasn't really anything being pushed game-wise that was like, you need the 32X because this is just a groundbreaking game that requires this much power. There was nothing like that. So there was nothing generating that buzz in the playground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people had realized that the Mega CD perhaps wasn't supported to a level that made it worth the cash outlay for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So to see Sega were kind of trying it again with the 32X, people were just already reluctant. And the last episode of Console Shock was about the Saturn and the reasons why it failed and what we could have done to save it. And I think one of the reasons was, they had these failed add-ons for the Mega Drive that didn't really catch fire and then were kind of dropped. So people kind of felt betrayed and were reluctant to support them with anything at that point going forward. Even though I think it was fairly clear that the Saturn was going to be well supported, although obviously it died much sooner than it might have done. I think it was clear to me that was a stopgap. But they weren't doing themselves any favors. And really the software that you got for the Mega CD, well, there were some good games that I think the Mega CD I think is worthwhile. I think maybe they could have gotten away with just releasing that and not bothering with the 32X. It was really the 32X that harmed them, I think, big time.
I agree. Going back, there's differences that you get with the CD attachment that you don't really see with the 32X, and the software library for the games, again, same kind of thing. Nintendo didn't really tend to do a lot of that. I mean, you kind of alluded to it before, that they had expansion modules that you could connect to like the N64, but they didn't do like the attachment. They certainly did revised versions of their consoles, which were cut down. Sega did the same as well with the Mega Drive 2 and the Master System 2. And it's basically just re-released the original console, but cut out some of the better features for like video and audio. And
it sucked.
But that was to bring it down to a price point to make it more competitive. And that's understandable, but that's kind of going the other way than what the Pro models are doing now.
I think you're right. And like the expansion pack, for example, which we've touched upon it a few times, that was basically RAM, wasn't it? It doubled the RAM of the N64. So you weren't really getting completely different, brand new games that you couldn't do. I mean, I think like Perfect Dark. I don't think that would really run very well at all without. I think most of the game is locked out to you without the expansion pack. I think it literally warns you.
Didn't it come with that? I know there was at least one game that it shipped with because it was required.
Donkey Kong, yeah.
Was it Donkey Kong? Oh, okay, yeah. I remember there was one. Yeah.
And I think Perfect Dark, most of the game was locked out to you. I think the single player campaign wouldn't run at all without the expansion pack. So I guess you do get, game, but you'd be like, oh, can I really be for those two games, the only ones where you're getting a dramatic difference. But to be fair, the expansion pack wasn't that expensive. It wasn't like a £300 bolt-on like the Mega CD was. I think it was about £100, or it might not even been that. It might have been less. It might have been £50. So it wasn't a big outlay. And if you potentially could get it with a game like Donkey Kong, so you kind of find. And then it will just be a nice little bonus on a lot of games. A lot of the games have a high frame rate mode or a high resolution mode that you could flip on. So you might get a bit of extra worth out of your games that you already own, the ones that came out after the expansion pack. So I think that was a kind of a worthwhile upgrade. Although it didn't really do anything. The N64 didn't already 90% of the time do, save for those two games. It goes back in terms of doing any kind of significant upgrades. I mean, you could actually go all the way back to the Atari 2600, where third parties released things like the Supercharger, which gave the Atari more RAM, and there was a certain selection of games for it. But I think of the first really successful example in my mind, you probably have to go over to Japan. And we're talking about the PC Engine. Now, obviously, where you are now in Canada, they would know the PC Engine as the TurboGrafx 16.
Yeah,
I'm really jealous of you, Al, because you're in a place where you can get a hold of TurboGrafx stuff.
Yeah, I've seen them. There's a few places locally that I've seen that in there, and it's one of those ones which, just from growing up in England, I just didn't see much of. I've not had much exposure to it, but I have absolutely noticed its presence here for sure.
I need to sort of give you some money one day. I'm like, look, get me a TurboGrafx 16 because I really want one. You might be able to find one a bit easier than I would. Yeah.
This does make me think, though, as well, that obviously with a lot of these consoles, we were kids. We did not have disposable income. We're now adults. We have disposable income. So we think more about what we're getting. And I remember watching a lot of videos of parents where some of their concerns were, why should I buy this new system if it's all new games and I have to and buy all new stuff? And so there was a lot of things where they were trying to keep a lot of backwards compatibility, because that was always a big important point. I know that's there's been episodes of Console Shock where we've talked backwards compatibility before as well. And that is another thing that I think has flipped, is that we've got a whole new generation of games, but there's backwards compatibility to try and support some of the older stuff. Right?
Yeah.
And now we're at a point where it's like there's, and I mean, this is my opinion. This is what I perceive. I could be wrong. Please do correct me if I am wrong. But it feels like there are fewer new games, unless you're looking at indie titles. But for like AAA games, there's fewer new ones, and it's more re-releases as kind of like we're bumping up specs. We're adding stuff to it. And so from the PS4 onwards, it's basically like, here's the same software library just with some added extras, as opposed to going like, here's new stuff, but we're supporting older games. It's basically like, these are still the older games.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to fall into the trap that a lot of people are. Though. There's no new games on PS5. It's all just remastered Spider-Man and Uncharted collection. I mean, there are new IPs that are coming out. I mean, if you go into the indie realm and the AA realm,
and that's what I was saying. Like,
everything is new.
Indie's great for that because there's always fresh ideas and stuff coming out. But I know that a lot of AAA franchises are pretty much a lot of re-releases. So it's not that this is everything, but yeah, and a lot of the big new games that are coming out are Assassin's Creed 15 and Horizon Zero Dawn 12 and all that stuff. Again, I'm not going to say they're all like that. There is new stuff, but when you compare it to, again, last show we talked about the Saturn and the launch games. The Saturn launch, nearly every game is a new IP. Yeah, I mean, we said that a big thing where the Saturn fell down was there was no Sonic game, and a lot of people will say, "Well, people wouldn't buy a console back then for just a Sonic game." I think they would. Sonic, absolutely.
You don't understand how big Sonic the Hedgehog was, and I argued that they should have just done a port of Sonic CD for the Saturn as a launch game, because most people wouldn't have played that game. No, like we just said, didn't we? We didn't have Mega CDs.
Yeah.
And this is a game we knew about from magazines and watching Games Master and Bad Influence. That was the only way. We probably didn't have mates. Very few people we would have known would have had a Mega CD.
Well, I
released it on the Saturn.
Absolutely, I agree entirely. I still recall going to. It was one of my parents was invited to a party, a house party somewhere, and so I was tagging along and I was playing with the kid that lived there. They had a Sega Saturn. It was my first time seeing one. They were brand new, so they'd just come out. And I was really surprised at the lack of a Sonic game. And it made me feel disappointed in the console. And it's a really weird concept to think of. It's just kind of like, how could you not have this? But it was just one of those. So there isn't one. There's no plans for one. And that was always something that you always tied in with Sega, that there would be Sonic in some form. Doesn't necessarily have to be another 2D platformer, but for him to just not exist, it's like, what is this Sega where we've had these add-ons which haven't really gone anywhere, and then you're going even further away where you're not even bringing along the stuff that worked. Well, I mean, really, like developing games like and releasing games on the Saturn like Clockwork Knight and Bug, which I like, but those are complementary games that should be alongside a Sonic game, not like literally those are the platform games. Yeah, that, you're supposedly going to be trying to sell a console with. So I mean, we're getting into a discussion about the fall of the Saturn a little bit here, which is obviously we could go on about all day. Yeah. But again, it didn't have that. Was a factor. Yeah, didn't have that killer app that. To allude to what we've been talking about before. And I think that's always a key thing with these things, is that whenever there's a new console generation, whether there's a new attachment for an existing console or a pro version of it, there has to be something more than just the hardware to make it worth it. Yeah. There has to be another game that really entices you beyond just it runs better. At least for me, that's why I haven't jumped in yet, because a lot of stuff that I'm seeing is just, it's better versions of what's there, but there's nothing that's there that's compelling me quite as much. And so this is one of the reasons why when the next Grand Theft Auto game comes out, I feel like I'll probably reevaluate the state of things, because that is an IP, that is an experience that I know could potentially be worth it. Yeah, and we alluded to the PC Engine, and I would say that was the first example of like a pro upgrade being worth it and actually being a huge success in Japan. And that's the CD attachment for the PC Engine. It was the first CD drive for a console. It came out in 1988. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think we got the Mega Drive, the Mega CD in like 92. So already like, pushing 5 years after Japan had the PC Engine CD.
So obviously it came out, it was cartridge based, or the Hue cards, or turbo chips, as you might know them in Canada with the turbo graphics. They're the same. They have Hue card written on them, actually, even though they've got turbo chip as well. But yeah, they had the CD attachment for the PC Engine in '88. I mean, it launched with a couple of fairly low-key titles, although kind of historically really important because they're the first console CD games ever, or a game on an optical media of any kind. I didn't using to this day.
Yeah, I didn't even know that they had a CD attachment. But I mean, again, PC Engine hasn't been my realm of expertise, but that's pretty good.
There is a rabbit hole. There is a rabbit hole, believe me. It came out in America. There was the TurboGrafx 16, the standalone console, but in America and Canada, the PC Engine CD did come over as the Turbo CD in 1990. Very, very expensive, like $400 on top of the console that you've already paid a couple of $100. So yeah, insanely expensive, but it came out.
So what did they do right that Sega did wrong then?
Well, I think they just supported it. I mean, it was NEC and Hudson Soft were the main. It's fairly simple, isn't it? Yeah.
Support does help. Yeah.
Yeah. They released games, it's crazy. They just supported the hell out of it. I mean, it had there's way more CD games than there is the Hue card, the physical cartridge format library. Obviously that's the opposite in terms of the Mega Drive. There's about 400 500 PC Engine CD games, and some of the best games on the system generally are the CD games. The CD drive actually had some upgrades during its lifespan. I think the last CD game came out in 1999. I think that was the last PC Engine game was in 99. So it got, nearly 10 years of releases. So incredible. It didn't really have the same life in America. The TurboGrafx obviously got killed by the NES and the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. The CD drive attachment for it. Some of those Japanese games did come over to the US. There was a few even exclusives actually that weren't in Japan that were on the Turbo CD. So they're kind of oddballs. But yeah, you had incredible games. One favorite of mine is Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which is my favorite Castlevania game. You've got Neo Geo ports. You've got a ton of Gradius 2 is one of my favorite games on the PC Engine. That's a CD game. You've got the Neo Geo ports. You've got ports from other consoles, ports from arcade games, a lot of Sega games. There's a version of Golden Axe on the PC Engine. It's actually terrible. But,
I was going to say, Golden Axe, but if it's terrible, then I'll give that a miss. Then
look it up though; it's kind of funny. Altered Beast was a CD game as well. Lots of shoot 'em ups, as I mentioned, as it's famous for the shoot 'em ups, generally on both the cards and the CDs. But yeah, literally hundreds of amazing games came out on the CD format. So you kind of, if you bought a PC Engine in Japan, you kind of had to get the CD attachment because you're like, God, I'm missing out on all these hundreds of games. I don't think it was cheaper there as well. And they did upgrade it. You could get, when you plugged in the CD drive into the PC Engine, you had to plug a card into the PC Engine side that was the RAM for the CD unit. It wouldn't work without it. But they released cards that had more RAM in. So you'd have super CD games. The super meaning this needs the super RAM upgrade. And that was just another Hue card that had an extra 1 megabit, which is about 64 kilobytes of memory or something. And there was some games that needed that card, and you'd get more animations, shorter loading times. Well, these were just, basic, fairly simple Hue card memory modules that plugged into the unit that would have been cost, a few dozen, equivalent of 30, 40 pounds. We're not talking hundreds of pounds. So it was easy to get these extra little things you could do for your CD-ROM drive. But yeah, I think that before we got to, we had the PS4 Pro and things like that. Certainly in that era pre-PlayStation, when we didn't really get any kind of upgrades, apart from the NES, the N64 with the expansion pack. We didn't really get anything for the Saturn or, there was RAM for the Saturn that you could get, but the PS1 didn't really have anything. before that era, that 32-bit era, I would say the PC Engine CD is probably the best example of a Pro upgrade. Although it's not really a new console, you're plugging something into the old one. But I think that's the best example because it had so many killer apps on that upgrade that you had to get it. So yeah, Al, you should check that out if you're interested in a bit of history there. Yeah,
absolutely. And would you say, just from all of that history, that just having a library of exclusive games for a set console generation is probably the thing that dictates whether it's successful or not?
Yeah, well, I guess probably not, really, because you look at the Sega Saturn, it's got some incredible exclusive games. Didn't make a difference in the end, did it? I love Sega Rally and Daytona and Virtua Fighter and Virtua Cop and House of the Dead, all of these incredible games. But well, I guess if you could, the PlayStation had tons of incredible exclusive games. So, and it was a case of which one do you pick, I guess, right at that point. And then the PS1's cheaper, the games are cheaper. Then you have more friends that have one. So it's probably a mixture.
Yeah. And by exclusive, I mean exclusive to that generation, not necessarily to that brand. So not like necessarily that's just a PlayStation exclusive or an Xbox exclusive. I think I'm meaning more in terms of, let's say a PlayStation 6 came out, that there were games that were designed for the PlayStation 6 as opposed to things that would kind of bump up. A little bit like with the PC Engine. You've got games that are coming out which require the CD, but there was just so many to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I think we both can testify to that, can't we? Because neither of us have a PS5. And there's really been anything that's come out. We were talking about Grand Theft Auto 6 and saying, well, that might be the thing that makes us pull the trigger. But there was things that I was vaguely interested in, like Ratchet and Clank, Rift Apart. But that's come out on the PC now, so I can play that on the Steam Deck. Spider-Man Remastered is on. I can play that on the Steam Deck. They're making these games for the PC now, so I don't really need a PS5. And I can't really. I mean, to be honest, it's probably only Grand Theft Auto 6 is the thing that would really make me pull the trigger. Yeah, but I think, a lot of people complain that it's not the way it used to be. Like when we grew up, like there were the libraries and the hardware, the technology in each console was so different that there'd be games you would get on one that you couldn't really get on the other. And the libraries would be so different that, obviously I certainly didn't have the money to have more than one until later on. But, it was one or the other when you were a kid. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I think that's why Sega was more popular in the UK, whereas Nintendo was more popular in North America, is because collectively you had to choose one. And it was typically what your friends were playing. And so there was a lot of factors there, but it definitely led to one being a winner versus the other in each territory.
I think the Mega Drive had a lot of things that worked in its favor in Europe. Like it did release a lot earlier than the Super Nintendo. I mean, the end of 1990 in the UK, whereas the Super Nintendo was like 92 in the UK, so nearly 2 years. And by that point, the Mega Drive was cheaper by about 30 quid, I think. So there was that. The games were cheaper. I mean, it always seemed to be that a Super Nintendo game would be like £50, whereas the Mega Drive, where you could get a game for 40 or 30. Yeah. So that and there wouldn't be that much different. In the SNES probably had better graphics, and some might say better audio. I really like the Mega Drive audio. But it kind of goes back again to what we were saying about how different the systems were. Games that were the same game on one or the other would be so different, wouldn't they? Like classic one is Mortal Kombat. The Super Nintendo version was so cut back. The Mega Drive version massively outsold it in the end. Because it was had the blood in it, and didn't necessarily look graphically better, but it had those features that people wanted. You don't really get that anymore. People have flame wars on Reddit of, this game runs the resolution is slightly higher on the PS5. It's like you're not losing anything in it being lower resolution on the Xbox. The game is the same, really, isn't it? If you zoom in you pause the game and zoom in on the bottom corner of the screen where there's some stairs, and you can count the pixels.
Yeah.
And you can, if you did that and that annoyed you because you didn't have as many as the PS4 5 version and it was lower resolution, I don't think anybody so we go back to what we said earlier about casual people don't care about this stuff.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of
exciting.
Yeah. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we have it like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as well, where not only were the games different, they had different names. You had Turtles in Time versus the Hyperstone Heist. They were kind of the same game, but they were also completely different. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really like both of them. I like Hyperstone because the levels are a bit shorter, but there's more of them. Yeah. And it's kind of a greatest hits of the first two arcade games, whereas on the Super Nintendo, it's basically just the Hyperstone game, isn't it? The Turtles in Time game.
Yeah, a couple of extra levels on top compared to what was in the arcade. Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that's right. And it's really hard to pull off the way you smack the guys on either side of you on the Mega Drive. That's really hard to pull off. Whereas on the Super Nintendo, you kind of do it accidentally. I don't know why the controls are a bit different in that sense, but a lot of those Konami games are funny. Like Sunset Riders is a really good one. I love that game. Yeah, it's hugely different on the Super Nintendo versus the Mega Drive. I think the Mega Drive is on an 8 megabit cart, whereas the SNES is on a 16 megabit. So yeah, I mean, and the music on the Mega Drive, so it suffered as a result.
These days, ports are judged by their performance and reliability as opposed to different features and different looks and different sounds to them. Yeah.
I mean, the amount of like the ROM chips that are available, to people that are making the cartridges, you have to buy them off Nintendo and Sega for your game. So you might have to make a decision, should we make the game 16 megabits or 8? Because it's going to cost us way more. We do 16 and they charge us this for 16 versus 8. Okay, we're going to go with 8. We'll have to cut all this out and move that out. But on the other console, we can get 16 megabits for the same as 8 on the other one. So we can add all that extra stuff in and it will sell more. And, whereas, the amount of storage you've got now on a Blu-ray it doesn't affect that at all, does it? It's on the user, really, isn't it, to get a bigger hard drive just to store however many games that they want. They both use like AMD chips now. They don't go and make their own chips because it's too expensive to do. They just get them off. They're basically PCs, really. They just run their own custom operating system. That's basically it. And that really started to happen, with the original Xbox, didn't it? With the Intel, which had a Pentium 3 as its CPU, and then you went to like the PS Triplet and the Xbox, which were Power PC, which obviously was for mainly people familiar with that from Macs in that same era, but that was PC sort of architecture, and it's kind of, you can't really get dramatic differences. They make one build of the game, really, don't they, and sort of tweak it slightly for whatever console it's going to land on, and you can barely notice the difference. So I guess obviously we're coming up to an hour. I think we can kind of wrap it up, but. I'm not sure there is a need. I understand why they did it with the PS4, back in 2016 when they released the Pro. There was these new TVs that were becoming common. Yeah. The older versions of those consoles couldn't really utilize them as well. And so they released new consoles that had a bit more, oomph, that could, take advantage of those extra pixels. Whereas that isn't really a thing now. So it's really just to get a bit of extra performance. I mean, maybe they know that and they think, we're just sending this to people that are hardcore, that really want the maximum frame rates or the best ray tracing performance. We know that's only going to be like 10 million people, but it'll be 10 million people that potentially will double dip. And they've already got a PS5 and they're going to get a Pro. So we've made double the money out of these people that that perhaps we wouldn't have before if we didn't bring out a Pro. Maybe, do you think that there's some truth in that? That's kind of cynical? Possibly.
It may also just be that as time goes on, if there hasn't been anything new, things can feel stale, whereas at least it might help reinvigorate the market in that regard. And, and maybe they know that, people who haven't jumped onto these may still end up joining that ecosystem with older models that they're picking up as well.
Yeah.
So people who wouldn't necessarily be going for it, at least there's going to be cheaper options that they can at least sell games to. And obviously that's kind of where my attention is being drawn to. So maybe they are also thinking about people like me. Who knows?
Well, yeah, you're literally the proof there.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting. And you know, the weird thing as well is it was difficult to get a PS5. You know, it didn't really become a thing that was easy to get in terms of just be able to walk into a shop and buy one until probably 2022, really.
Yeah. And you also have scalpers as well.
You had scalpers, and that meant you couldn't really get them until. So, you know, a lot of people probably didn't pick up a PS5 until 2022 and 2023. And now, you know, a Pro's going to come out. I don't think those people are going to be, you know, particularly enthusiastic about that. But, well, the people that I guess, like I said, that niche group of people that it's being aimed at, possibly, they'll be the ones that will pick it up. Just be interested to see if Xbox come up with something. I mean, there are rumors. The most interesting Xbox rumors that, for me, are they're going to make an Xbox handheld. I think that would be awesome. Yeah.
So kind of like a Switch type system.
Yeah. I think they're going to drop having an in their next hardware, instead of having an S and an X versions, the S being the lower powered, cheaper one, and the X being the high power one. The S will be a handheld. Because if you're going to make a lower powered one, you know, maybe you could just shave off a few things. You can then stuff it into a handheld, which would be a really compelling thing. And the X will be the home, you know, the TV based system that will be more performance, but you'll be able to play the same games on both. I think that would be great. I would get an Xbox handheld, a Series S handheld, whatever it ends up being called. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen. Yeah, we've certainly seen from the Switch and the Steam Deck just how much demand there's been for that kind of form factor as well.
Yeah, I would presume you'd be able to just plug the Xbox handheld, whatever they call it, into the TV and just play and it'll basically would be what is a current Series S, a lower powered version that plays the same games just at a bit lower, you know, resolution and a bit lower frame rate. But I would take that hit, you know, to be able to have something that I can carry with me. I mean, I'm basically full-time handhelds now. I don't really play a home system that plugs into a TV, and it always is in the TV. And it was really the Switch that made me, because the Switch was obviously the first sort of device that did that well. So it's created an arms race, really, isn't it, with all these other ones that have followed in its wake. But it'd be good if Sony did that. You know, obviously they had the PSP, they had the Vita. They've got more experience in that than a lot of people, really. So I know you've got the PlayStation Portal, which is a pretty rubbish device because it's just a streaming device. But an actual, you know, lower powered PS5 in a handheld would be incredible. I think for that, a lot of people would buy that. But yeah, that's it. Well, Al, obviously you don't join us every single time, so would you be able to tell us where people can find you on the interwebs at the moment?
Well, I'm just launching a new site called Nostalgia Zone. Yep. So you'll be able to find that pretty soon. It's nostalgia.zone is the web address.
Wicked.
Yeah. So that's because I don't tend to do social media and things these days. But
don't blame you.
There. Yeah. But that'll be where my little home on the World Wide Web is. It's a love letter to the old internet, and just going to be filled with articles about things that make me feel nostalgic from my childhood, which will include some retro gaming stuff as well. So definitely check that out as time goes on.
Yeah, everybody check that out. And me and Al, of course, have been doing our Star Trek show for a few years now. We do kind of pop a little note about it in each Console Shock episode in the show notes on YouTube, and I think on our consoleshock.net site as well. Check that out if you want to hear us talk more about Star Trek and particular episodes, and also, you know, Star Trek memorabilia and nostalgic stuff from our childhoods around the franchise. You can see that. Just search for Long Range Sensors. and you'll be able to hear more from us on there. But thank you, everybody, as always, for listening, and we will catch you in the next one. Take care.